As always, great to be with you all. And tonight we're continuing our study through the book of Genesis. And we'd like to talk about today, who are the sons of God? Who are the sons of God? And first, when we get into this lesson, as there are different opinions offered about this topic, probably the first thing that comes to mind, anybody familiar with this discussion, is why does it matter? Why is it important? Why speak on it? What value does it have? Well, there are two reasons why it's valuable to address it going through our study in Genesis. First of all, it's simple enough. We don't want to pass over it because this is where we're at in the study, and we want to understand it. And second of all, if we can understand this clear in our mind and see if we can find what the Bible correctly teaches on it, we will understand the book of Genesis better. Because as we are already seeing in the book, there are themes in this book, there are repeated ideas in this book, and God through Moses is using repetition. Why? In the context, it is to teach the children of Israel valuable lessons, and eventually in the greater picture, we get to learn from the lessons that he taught them. But it's not just Genesis, it's not just Leviticus. These are the books of Moses. It is the law of Moses, and they, as we've already discussed, they should be viewed together, because a lot of those same themes are going to carry over as Moses was instructing God's people in the wilderness. So we want a clear view. We're going to continue on and maybe get further and talk about some principles of the flood if we can get to them, and things we learn as we go on in Genesis. But we don't want to be confused here when we get to chapter 6. And so we want this clear in our mind what it means here. Let's open to the book of Genesis, and we will be considering two of the popular views, both of them. But we want to see, by looking everywhere in the Bible, what the conclusion is, what God is saying in His Scripture. First, we want to pick up where we left off last week. We saw that there was Cain and there was Abel, who ended up being murdered by his brother Cain. And Cain's line appeared to continue down a path of violence. We see one of his descendants, Lamech, in verse 23. And Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. So the Bible wanted us to know that violence continued on through the line of Cain. By the time we get to the flood, we see in chapter 6, verse 11, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Down in verse 13, and God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. So we saw that it began with Cain and it carried on down his family line. However, when we get to chapter 4, verse 25 of that same chapter with Cain, it says in verse 25, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. So he's replacing Abel. And for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Now we talked about in chapter 3, the seed of the serpent will be against the seed of the woman. Well, man now has this curse because of sin, and when she gave birth to Cain, way back at the beginning of chapter 4, we see that Eve said of Cain that the Lord had given her, right there in verse 1, a man with the help of the Lord, or man-child? Well, when she has Seth, that text calls Seth her offspring. And so what we see the words of the text say is that Seth is the offspring, that same word seed, the seed of the woman. But, of course, what Satan tempted Adam and Eve to do, commit sin, whoever continued down then and down the line and continued towards the path of sin would be the seed of that. The seed of that, the offspring of that. And we saw another similarity that God told the man, Adam, cursed is the ground because of you. And he gives him the curse about the thorns and thistles it will produce. And he told the serpent, cursed are you, more than all livestock. And Abel was a keeper of the livestock, and Cain was he brought the fruit of the ground to the Lord. So I think that is all just reinforcement to show what continued on through Cain's line, but Seth, on the other hand, his descendants, in verse 26 says at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. But we saw earlier in chapter 4, Cain left the presence of the Lord. But God gave Cain a mark so that no one would strike him. Now, this is the part of the lesson where I will say, this isn't a hill I want to die on. This is just, when we study the Bible, we don't like to use the word opinion a lot, but if we can't determine something for sure, we need to say it, because we don't want to say something if we don't know for sure. But in this regard, this doesn't make, a whole lot of difference. But the mark of Cain, I think we have some good ideas, because we see that it is after this event with Cain and Abel, as you can see in verse 17, that Cain began having children. And we know many times, and you look at, most of the Old Testament, when someone had children, they were a certain age. We have some of those ages. And keep in mind that man was living a long life at this point. Hundreds to up to 900 and something years old. And so this tells me that Cain was still very young, but he was still of age to know right from wrong, because we see in other places what that word youth meant. And we know David was called a youth, and so he could have been, maybe, we can't say for sure, but 15 to maybe 20 years of age, around that type of bracket, maybe possibly a little older. But the fact is, he was still young. Now, if somebody wanted to strike Cain, meaning it's not like they weren't able to make that choice to. They want to do it. He said, anyone who, he put a mark on him so that no one would strike him. So obviously they're seeking revenge, but what would make them not want to strike him? Well, again, we need to look at the themes of Genesis and the following books, even going beyond the law of Moses. In Numbers chapter 13, why did the Israelites, even though they were promised the land, why did they not want to strike the Canaanites? And we're going to go to that verse. They had saw their great height. Their great height. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, none of the Israelites wanted to strike Goliath because of his great height and size. And we're told, the amount of cubits he is, some have lended based on what we think the most accurate length of cubit is. He was probably close to 10 feet tall. And we're not surprised. We see people beyond 7 feet today. Why would we think there weren't people larger than that? But the point is that there's a theme in the books of Moses and after that the reason they didn't want to strike these people was because of their great height. Why wouldn't someone want to strike Cain? well, if I see someone towering above me, I'm not going to want to strike them either, Unless you're someone like David, you have a promise of God where he says, it doesn't matter, I'm going to give you Canaan, then you should trust in that promise. And they did not. But anyways, so that's how I see the mark of Cain, especially when we follow this line of Cain's descendants. We see violence continue on in that path. And what's the problem by the time when the sons of God take the daughters of men in Genesis 6? We see the problem is violence. God says the earth is filled with violence, and I'm going to make an end of all flesh, like we just read, because the earth is filled with violence. And so it would make sense how, of course, we're not saying that none of them followed God on one side and none of them fell away on the other. We're not saying that what was true for one was true for all. But the fact is, it appears through one side there was this problem of violence, and on the other side there was at least a big effort by most of them to call upon the name of the Lord and follow him. And so when you have all those pieces, it makes sense that those who were the seed of the serpent, who continued to follow the way of sin, they ended up turning to idols and became the descendants of Canaan and became idolatrous, immoral people. While as God, through Noah and his sons, and eventually Abraham and his descendants, he was able to have that remnant of people who still followed and obeyed God through what became the Israelites. And then in time, you keep going down the line, and of course, if it's that same seed of the woman, and now that becomes Israel, the Messiah will come through Israel, while as the other nations have all turned away to idols. And so it makes perfect sense when you line it up that way. And when we ignore the big break of chapter 5 and 6, you see in chapter 5, verse 1, he says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, so he blessed them and named them man when they were created. And when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth." And so the sons of Seth still had that same image of God. It's almost like he's saying that just because they're Adam's sons, make no mistake, he still has the image and likeness of God. And so Adam had descendants, but they are still children of God. And so in chapter 5, following Seth's line, he's going to just, you box every time you see the word son. And Seth lived and fathered Enosh, and he fathered a son, and so fathered a son, and they fathered a son. But the point at the beginning of chapter 5 is what? That they are still in the image and likeness of God. And when God created man in his image, two things. He said, secondly, he said to have dominion, so to rule, just like how God rules. But the idea is to manage creation. But the first thing he told them was be fruitful and multiply. Perhaps suggesting that just as God created us to be his children, he gave us the ability to have children first and foremost. How are we in the image of God? First and foremost, because we were meant to be his children. And so when you ignore that big chapter break in chapter 6, and you see that this was all a book meant to be read together, then you know who the sons of God are in verse 2 of chapter 6. They are those who have that same image of God in chapter 5. The sons of Adam and so on, but they were all made according to that same image. It's just that the others had turned away, and then man began to multiply on the face of the earth. Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, that's the first thing he says. So when they multiplied on the face of the earth, obviously a lot of those who chose the path of evil had multiplied also. And then the sons of God had chosen the wrong people to marry. And it led to problems. Now, what do I mean that this becomes repetition and a continued theme in the books of Moses? Well, because it fits perfectly later on in the book of Numbers, we're going to see that the Israelites, as Paul words it later, sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play, and they fell to idols because of the Moabites, the Moabite women. Later in Deuteronomy, he says, "You shall not intermarry with the women of Canaan, because they will turn your heart away from following me, and then I will destroy you." Well, what happened in Genesis chapter 6? They turned their heart away from him, and then he ended up destroying them. It's the same parallel, and when you read that in the book of Deuteronomy, you see that sequence. He says, "You shall not intermarry with them. They'll turn your heart away and after other gods, and then I will destroy you." You see how all of that is parallel because it's the same theme. What was God's point? You know the law with your mind. I'm teaching you the law with your mind. But with your heart, you can be turned away from me. And you're going to have all these people around you. And marriage was a very huge theme in the books of Moses. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You just see it repeated and repeated. Especially you see Jacob, and when he married Rachel, she took her father's household gods. And so it's repetition. And so we don't want to lose sight of that fact. But that being said, there are two views that go around in Genesis chapter 6. And some say, which we've kind of already looked at this view, that the sons of God were those descendants of Adam, but specifically through Seth, because they continued to follow the way of God, and they continued to call upon the name of the Lord, but eventually they married the wrong person, and those women who were not trying to follow God, and they were turned away from God, and the earth became violent because of, the next generation, and the next generation keeps turning away. And by the way, just to make a note, we see God being the overall author of the Old Testament and the New Testament. You see that repeated later on when Solomon has all the wisdom of God in the world, and it says that he loved the Lord in 1 Kings and used to sacrifice to him daily. But the foreign women, that Solomon clung to these women in love, and they turned his heart away after following him, and Solomon began to serve the other gods, and that was the destruction of the nation of Israel. You see the theme repeated, and you see the warning in the books of Moses and what happened. So that is the first view. The second view, you may be familiar with, is that these sons of God are actually angels. And some believe that the angels had rebelled against God in heaven, and that they came down and took human women as their wives, and the offspring of these angels and the women became the giants called the Nephilim. So that's the second view, and probably they would hear the first view and say, that makes a lot of sense, what we've gone through so far. But I think the biggest thing is, how would you explain the New Testament book of Jude and 2 Peter, where it appears like he's saying that the angels had rebelled, and where that is connected with the days of the flood? Well, we're going to get to Jude, and we're going to get to 2 Peter and see if that is the only possibility that is going on there, if it truly is what Jude and 2 Peter are saying. But we want to make this point first, that in Genesis chapter 6, let's just start reading there so we can see what it's saying and then address it piece by piece. We want to address this first. It says in verse 1, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose." And we underline any. And why would God bring that up unless it had something to do with what he was going to say next? In verse 3, "Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Why would he bring up the first part unless it had something to do with the second part? Why would he bring up the fact that they chose any in marriage that they wanted because they were attractive? That would be totally out of the blue. But he says, then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever. Well, verse 4, this is what we want to address first. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. In other words, you can't make the case that the giants were a product of angels taking women as wives, because he said they were already there in those days. Now, let's ask ourselves, who is Moses speaking to when he wrote these books? Well, it's called the Law of Moses, and he's going to give it to the Israelites in the wilderness so that they can learn who God is and what sin is and not repeat the same mistakes their ancestors made, and so that they can enter the land of Canaan and live by the law. So, that being said, let's go over to Numbers chapter 13. Numbers chapter 13, where Moses is speaking to the people in the wilderness. Numbers chapter 13, and look at verse 27. This is after they spy out the land. He says, and they told him, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea along the Jordan. So they're talking about the people, the descendants of Anak, were many of the people of Canaan who lived there. When you get to the end of the chapter, it says in verse 32, so they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. So why is Moses bringing up the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6? Well, now we know why. Because that is who the people of Israel were dealing with in the land of Canaan. And they needed to have the faith that God promised us the land, and we can overcome them. And so Moses' point, someone says, why bring up the Nephilim there if they weren't giants as a product of the angels? The reason is because, as Moses said in Genesis 6, the Nephilim were already on the earth in those days. So what Moses is saying to the people in the wilderness is, I know you've seen these Nephilim in the land of Canaan. They're the sons of Anak, and they have this great height, and they are really strong, and you said you seem like grasshoppers. But I want you to know that these Nephilim existed in the days of Noah as well, and even before then. And they existed, these men of great height, but Noah, as we read in our New Testament verses, Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so Noah, he was around when those Nephilim were there as well. And he was faithful, and his family was faithful, and God saved them. So why wouldn't God be able to save you too? And that is the point he's making with the Nephilim. They existed in Noah's day, but it didn't matter because Noah was faithful and God saw him through. But we make that connection because we want to know that the sons of Anak, later called in Deuteronomy the Anakim, they were descendants from the Nephilim. And so Nephilim referred to these giants. They were already there, and they were the sons of Anak who came from them in the time of Moses. Well, now let's go over to the book of Deuteronomy, which is the same context. The people in the wilderness, their generation did not believe. They were afraid of when they spied and saw these giants. So God said that generation will not enter the land of Canaan because they did not trust what I said, but they feared. And so the younger generation is to learn from their parents' mistakes and have faith. And so that's the context of the book of Deuteronomy. But let's look over here in Deuteronomy chapter 1, and just look at verse 28. And he's recounting what all has happened, and he said, "Where are we going up? Our brothers have made our hearts melt, saying the people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven, and besides, we have seen the sons of the Anakim there." So the same people. And Moses told them in verse 29, "Do not be in dread or afraid of them." Well, then you keep reading and you go down to Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 10. Or actually, we can back it up to verse 9. And it says, "And the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar to the people of Lot for a possession. The Emim formerly lived there, a people great and many, and as tall as the Anakim." So there were many giant people. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, who are also giants, if you study these books. But the Moabites call them the Emim, and that means terrors. Emim, they called them terrors. And so they had these different names for them, and they were known people, and a lot of them were similar when it comes to height. But what's his point? That God, he allowed Moses to conquer these territories. He promised things to Lot. He promised things to Abraham. And so their height and their size should not cause you to fear them and not trust what the Lord has promised you. Now, why do we bring it up? Because there's something important we get in Deuteronomy chapter 32, and we'll get there next. What's one of the other reasons people say the sons of God are angels? Because I've heard it worded exactly this way, that in the other places that the term sons of God comes up in the Old Testament, it's referring to angels. So one day I did a search, and I wanted to see how many times that phrase comes up. Because you look at it and it'll say like 4 or maybe 4 to 6 other times. And it sounds misleading because you're like, oh, every other time. But the only book it comes up in, other than these books of Moses, is the book of Job. And so when you look at the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 6, he says, "There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And then the Lord said to Satan, 'From where have you come?'" So we see that, okay, that doesn't really prove anything. Then you get to chapter 2, verse 1. He says, "Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord." Okay, it sounds like angels, but it's not really proven yet. But it definitely sounds like that. But then you get to chapter 38 of Job, when the Lord finally responds to Job out of the whirlwind. And he says in verse 4, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurement? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." So at the creation, they were already there, and so therefore it must not be referring to humans, but to angels. But you see the problem. All of these so-called references in the Old Testament were only found in the book of Job, and there was only 3 of them, 2 of which were in a context where Job's not even trying to explain who they are. He's just saying that they were there. And we only know who he's talking about because in chapter 38, we see that they were there at creation already. You get the problem. What if Job and Moses are just using the same term to refer to different people? We see that in every other book in the Bible. For instance, Paul, the apostle, wants to get the Galatians to see that you're saved through faith. But James says that faith without works is dead. Well, both things are true. You have to understand the context of what he's talking about. Yeah, we're saved through faith and we get grace through Jesus Christ. But if someone wants to say, I have that faith so I can live however I want, and I'm not going to do anything that God wants me to do, well, the point is that's not real faith. But James is saying faith without any works is dead. You see things like that all over the Bible where two authors, they're using the same term or the same word, but they're talking about different things. Sons just means children. So, is it possible that he's talking about children of God in Job because he wants you to see that there are other spiritual beings? And they came before God and Satan was there too. While as in Genesis, Moses is stressing, you have this special relationship with God as his children on earth. And God created you to be his children, and you should be following him. They're not talking about the same thing. Okay, so I don't think we should define what one author is saying by looking at what another author says. We know God's the ultimate author, but you get what we're saying. A couple other references used in the same book, all that proves is it's a different author. We have to ask ourselves, what was Moses saying? And then we can have the whole Bible fit together. But we run into problems when we say, I'm going to define what this author says by looking at what this author says. No, we have to say, what is the context in the actual book? Do we have anything in the actual books written by this same author where we can determine by the context who he's talking about? Well, have we even done that first in Genesis? Everything so far in Genesis looks like he's talking about humans. But we haven't gone to the final place. I just wanted to go there in Job to present that other fact that where some people might believe that. Let's go back to Deuteronomy, and I think there's something that many people, even who make the argument for angels, have not considered. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 32. This is the Song of Moses that he's giving them towards the end. And look at Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4. So same author, same books, same context. And what does this author say? Verse 4, the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity. Just and upright is he. They have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. Who's he talking about in context? That generation who turned away from God and those who will. But verse 6, do you thus repay the Lord, you foolish and senseless people? Notice he's already talking to Israel. Then he says, is he not your father who created you, who made you and established you? And then he says, remember the days of old. So if he's talking to Israel already, and he says, remember the ancient days, then he must be talking about a time before Israel. He says, consider the years of many generations. What phrase was constantly repeated, making the natural divisions of the book of Genesis? These are the generations. These are the generations of Adam. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These are the generations of Isaac. These are the generations of Jacob, of Esau. These are the generations. Remember the days of old. Remember the ancient days before you, Israel. And remember the years of many generations. In other words, we've already talked about this in the book of Genesis. Ask your father, and he will show you. Your elders, and they will tell you. Now we have a time frame in verse 8. When the Most High gave to the nations, that's not Israel, that's the other nations. It cannot be talking about Israel. Their inheritance. So we got to ask, when did God give the other nations their inheritance? When he divided mankind. He fixed the orders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Now, that's what the English Standard Version says. If you're reading the New American Standard, these are just different translations. The New American Standard, I believe that might say sons of Israel. I know the King James Version, has a different rendering, but depending on the translation, you might have sons of God if you're reading the ESV. You might have sons of Israel, and you might have angels of God. The reason for this is the Masoretic text, which was not the earliest manuscript we have. That one has the sons of Israel. The Septuagint, which was just the Greek translation, so it was already translated, has angels of God. While as the Dead Sea Scrolls has sons of God. The Dead Sea Scrolls is the oldest manuscript of the Old Testament we have. And you don't have, most of the differences you have in these manuscripts are not significant. And you can look at them and it's just like, maybe for the animals, one says a bird and one says a bat, stuff like that. But this is one of the more meaningful ones. But the idea is the Dead Sea Scrolls was the oldest manuscript, but both say sons of. We've already seen by the context, he's not talking about Israel because he's talking about the nations. So that rules out the possibility that he's talking about the sons of Israel, because he's already gone back. So even if you didn't have all these different, even if you weren't aware of this by context, you would look at the context and say, no, I don't think that's what he could be talking about. You would just need the context. As for the Septuagint, if the Jewish people already had the idea that it was talking about angels, then it makes sense if they didn't understand it and they just say, oh, he must be talking about angels, so we'll put angels here. But the Masoretic text was copied more scrupulously because they were scribes, but they were copied later on. The Dead Sea Scrolls is still one of the leading sources we use for the Old Testament because it was basically identical to the Masoretic text, but it was older, see. And so we use all of them, and so people want to, make it like, the Bible has been changed and all these things, but we have all these copies, and they say, almost identically the same thing. And when they don't, in a place like this, we have the context to determine. So there is no big question mark. All we have to ask ourselves is do some study and say, when did God divide mankind? When did God give the nations, not Israel, their inheritance? When did God fix the borders of the people? And all we have to do is remember what we've already read in the book of Genesis and go back, because remember, these are to be read as a complete set. Go back to Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9. Verse 18 reads, the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed, or divided. When you get to chapter 10, verse 1, he says, these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. In verse 5, he says concerning Japheth, from these the coastland people spread in their lands, each with their own language, by their clans in their nations. When he talks about the sons of Ham in verse 20, he says these are the sons of Ham by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. When he talks about, in verse 32, or rather, verse 30, he says, the territory in which they lived extended from Mesha in the direction of Sephar to the hill country of the east. These are the sons of Shem by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. And then he repeats it in verse 32. These are the clans of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies and their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. In chapter 11, verse 4, the Tower of Babel, they want to build the tower lest we be dispersed or separated. Verse 8, so the Lord dispersed, separated, and you guessed it, that's the same word that's going to become the word for holy or set apart that we heard another theme of back in Genesis chapter 1. He says it separated or dispersed again in verse 9. And so we know when the nations were separated and divided and given their inheritance. And Deuteronomy said they were divided according to the number of the sons of God. If you say angels, it don't make sense. If you say Israel, it makes no sense. But it makes perfect sense if the earth was separated according to the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who were still the sons of God, because only Noah and his sons were at that time followed the Lord faithfully. Everyone else, they used to be sons of God, but they took the daughters of men and they turned to violence. But Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth were the ones who were faithfully following the Lord. And after the flood, when the floodwater subsided, God separated the nations according to their sons. And he gave the nations their inheritance. And so why did Moses say to ask your father, ask the elders, ask, and he's speaking to people before Israel. Because it was in that time, before Israel was ever even a country, a nation born, that's when the nations were divided. That's when they received their lands, and they had their languages, and they were separated by their boundaries. So it makes perfect sense. When it's the sons of God and all of that is considered, the whole picture fits. And it fits along with the context. The only question that remains is, what about what Jude says? And what about what 2 Peter says? Isn't he talking about angels there? And we're out of time today, though, so we'll get to Jude and 2 Peter next week, and we'll try and see what Jude is talking about and what Peter is talking about. But as far as the context of these actual books, we see what Moses is talking about, and we see how it all fits together. If it's angels, it makes no sense in the context. That's just out of the blue. If it's the sons of God who were still faithfully following him, then everything else in the books of Moses makes sense. But we'll get to Jude and 2 Peter next week, and we'll go ahead and offer our invitation. If you're not a child of God today, whether you need to learn how to do it or whether you're ready to make that step to put on Christ in baptism, we offer that opportunity right now. But if you need prayers of the congregation or the family of God, please make that known as well as we stand and sing our invitation song.